Hi, I'm Dave Wang from Fuller Seminary, and welcome to this first session of the second day of our conference. As was shared a little earlier, we are shifting the conversation from biblical and theological perspectives on divine transformation onto psychological perspectives on the topic. So we are going to invite a number of psychologists to enter into this interdisciplinary conversation. So get ready for a little less Bible, a little less theology, and a little more freakiness.
We didn't agree on that intro.
So the presenter for our first session is my friend and colleague Stephen Sandage from Boston University, and our respondent is also my friend and colleague Alexis Abernethy, who's also my boss at Fuller Theological Seminary. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Steve.
Hey, do you want to give me a 2-minute notice? Okay, great. Hey, good morning, folks. Really fun, stimulating day yesterday, so I'm excited to get into more of this. Thanks, Steve, and to your team for this invitation. Really honored to be here. So I'm going to just hit some high points. You've had a chance to look at the paper if you wanted to on relational spirituality. Todd Hall and I have a double header this morning of relational spirituality, a lot of overlap, I think, due to our long-time interactions, and I think our papers will have a little bit of difference of emphasis. So let me just hit some high points. One of the questions from Steve was, what is it about human persons that they are morally transformed by God in these ways? And so as a psychologist, I'm trying to speak to some aspects of humanity, human nature, theological anthropology that inform a model, this relational spirituality model, which is a theory of change. It's a relational, contemplative, social justice-oriented model of spiritual formation and change. We psychologists really deal in the realm of individual differences. That's one way to think about what we do. So we're always looking at questions of why do two individuals sitting in the same pew at church have such different responses to the same sermon or liturgy? What helps us understand the different patterns of response spiritually for folks who seem to be in the same context? And in particular, I'm going to reference some response to the question, what actually accounts for or mediates change in terms of spiritual transformation? So mediating factors in psychology are factors that account for change, so I'll try to show you a little bit of that. We've had full disclosure here, funding from a number of sources, particularly right now the Peel Foundation and the Association of Theological Schools is having us do some work on how to assess relational spirituality in seminary students. So I'm not going to linger on virtues. We've had some good discussion of virtues. I assume that you're all pretty familiar with this concept. One of the key ideas from this model is that it's really relational dynamics in particular that are the focus of virtue formation in this model. It's different qualities of relational experience, both with God, but also with other human persons that are the key dynamics that lead to virtue and vice. Another way of putting that would be that it's very hard for people to be transformed into virtue without important qualities of relational experience that are part of that process. The relational spirituality model, again, foregrounds relational dynamics with God, with the sacred, with human community. One of Todd's former colleagues at Rosemead, Nancy Duvall, talked about our unconscious theologies, those implicit images of God and the sacred that are operative in our limbic brain, a lot of right brain functioning. Dr. Carpenter's point yesterday about knowledge gaps in our Christian community sparked my awareness that I think a number of the issues we talked about yesterday could be related in psychology to right brain functioning, which I think you'll pick up on some, Todd, too. Implicit indirect experiences, the role of emotions, the role of relational dynamics. These are dynamics that are sometimes not quite explicitly discussed or are hard to put our finger on in Christian communities. I would say my own theological education, which I enjoyed, was about as left brain dominant as it could have been. A lot of rational, propositional, discursive emphasis, which I loved, and right brain was not accessed quite as much. And yet we know in psychological research that these aspects of right brain functioning are highly influential on human behavior. So the RSM, the Relational Spirituality Model, emphasizes this dialectic of spiritual dwelling and seeking, and tracks how that unfolds in individuals and in communities. So dwelling, when it's going well spiritually, can involve intimacy with God, a sense of grounding in God's presence and in community. Those are a couple aspects of dwelling that can be very helpful, of course, to formation. Seeking is when we're stretching into something new and different, perhaps wrestling with a complicated question about suffering, or engaging folks of diverse spiritual and theological traditions, as we might get a little bit of here. We hear someone who is understanding God differently than us. We might be stretching into a new spiritual practice that's unfamiliar. And so in the RSM, we've been interested in noting how that dialectic of dwelling and seeking is working its way in me over time. Another way of putting it is that I do believe God calls us to dwelling and to seeking, but not always for every person in exactly the same rhythms. So relational development is key to how we view spiritual formation in this model. And so there's these three relational development systems that have overlapping functions but slightly different emphases. Attachment, differentiation, intersubjectivity. I'm not going to unpack all of that. Todd, I know you will engage some of this stuff too. As in particular, I'm focusing on the differentiation system, not because I think the others are irrelevant, but we have more data on differentiation in relation to spiritual formation, more empirical data. What do I mean by differentiation? This is a complex construct, and it would be interesting to hear theological corollaries in theological language. But this is a concept that comes out of the family systems literature originally, but a lot of schools of social science, that involves capacities for emotion regulation. We haven't really named emotion regulation as much so far that I've heard, but we've been talking about emotions. These are the capacities to work with my emotions with awareness, but some ability to regulate or process emotional experiences, vast individual differences, as you might surmise or experience after you give a sermon to your congregation, and people have different emotional reactions. Folks that are differentiated also tend to have a relational flexibility of being able to manage both autonomy and connection. Some great spiritual writers like Bonhoeffer said that we need to be able to do solitude and we need to be able to do community, and that speaks to a kind of relational maturity. Differentiation is also necessary to do this sort of balancing of dwelling and seeking. When do I need to get grounded? When do I need to stretch into something new and challenging? Lots more I could say here, but one of the key issues is that in the RSM, we're particularly interested in how I deal with the realities of human differences. Differences of race, of gender, of sexual orientation, of religious tradition or affiliation. And so the RSM was developed both to kind of understand human flourishing, how can I grow spiritually and experience good things in life, and also to try to understand what we've called mature alterity. How do I relate across differences? Which I think is a particular challenge in our world and in our religious communities. So we've been really interested in what are the relational spirituality dynamics that I need to relate well across various sociocultural differences. I probably need capacities, spiritual capacities for self-soothing and self-confrontation. And when I say self, I don't mean apart from God, but that I've got some capacity to get myself grounded and also to allow God to confront me about realities I need to face. I need to be able to root into existential anchors that help me tolerate suffering that's necessary for growth. These are all aspects of differentiation. I said in the paper that I view God as living constantly in differentiated relationship in an ideal, exemplary way. So God as Trinity is a differentiated relationship. And that is the ultimate grounding, I believe, for human differentiation. When I say mediation, this depicts kind of the overall model that relational virtues and aspects of relational spirituality interact. If we're looking at outcomes like eudaimonic well-being or flourishing, mature alterity, hopefully reducing spiritual struggles for folks, from this model, it's relational development factors that are these middle factors or mediating factors that account for this set of relationships in our view. And differentiation I put in orange because that's where we have the most empirical data. I do think attachment's really important, but differentiation is where we have the most findings. So I did a review of our findings from our research team, perhaps more than you were interested in, I'm not sure. But that's what some of us empirical researchers do. It was actually good for me to bring it all out of the closet and look at it, so it helped me. I don't know if it helped you. But we have a lot, the bulk of the point here is we have a lot of data from 21 studies with lots of faith leaders and other folks to suggest differentiation is related to a lot of salutary spiritual formation outcomes. That means folks who are really low in differentiation or struggling with that for various reasons will probably have some predictable struggles in spiritual formation. We have some evidence of mediation processes too that suggest this is potentially a really important part of change. Last thing I'll say here, this is in our Transforming Spirituality book if you want to try to digest this crucible image of the movement between dwelling and seeking. I won't unpack this a lot, but we think crucibles are really important. They are the dissonant intersections of what we value or what we're trying to move towards in our current developmental capacity. So I have faith leaders sometimes who want to have a good marriage. That's why they're in my office. And they don't have the capacity for that at this time. And if they're going to grapple with that dissonance and make some choices about how they're going to live, that is probably going to heat up a crucible. And there's various kinds of crucibles about various issues in life. We might think of them as very deep integrity dilemmas that require us to again, ground into what we think is most important. So just quickly, a few implications of this. I think we need to think about relational ecologies for transformation. And when I say, relationships, community transform people, I hope it's obvious. I don't mean we can just throw people in a small group or in relationships and this necessarily happens, right? Relational or community dynamics are like restaurants. There's a lot of restaurants out there and a few of them are good. What we need to do is attend to quality, mature relational experience, right? So that's one of the implications. We need to think more about embodiment as part of formation from an integrative lens, psychology and theology. How does embodiment factor into transformation? Paradoxically, I think virtue formation often comes out of vulnerability and struggles. I think sometimes we can help people grow in gratitude or humility, not by directly pushing them towards adopting that virtue, which might involve more impression management than actual virtue growth. We need to meet people in the depths of their struggles with those processes. Forgiveness is an area I've worked with a lot. I'm rarely trying to steer people directly towards forgiveness. I'm trying to connect with them and relate with them in the struggles they're having with unforgiveness. I think that's an important thing to work. And then finally, the areas of diversity competence, cultural humility, social justice work are much more connected to virtue and spiritual formation than I think we've widely acknowledged in the Christian community. So we have a lot of data on that I reported in the paper as well. And so I think there's great potential to work those angles together to see that human diversity and virtue and spiritual formation are intimately connected. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'll bring this down a little bit. Steve, your work is so profound, the extensiveness of it, and it has served as a wonderful foundation for my work. So I thank you. And it's really impressive. I don't even know how he is able to do all of the work that he does, but thank you for those contributions. I want to thank Steve Porter for the invitation, and I want to begin by noting 3 dimensions of my identity that inform my response to Steve's work. First, as a spirituality and health researcher who studies worship, I'm thankful to have this opportunity to discuss Steve Sandage's piece on relational spirituality and virtue formation, exploring mediation through human and divine differentiation. Second, as a United Methodist preacher's kid, I grew up in a Christian family that included my parents, grandmother, and my 2 brothers. I recognized, even before becoming a Christian, that my grandmother's faith reflected something different about her walk in God. She did not simply practice her faith, she lived her faith. This living out of her faith reflected what I came to understand as abiding in Christ. She was committed to our family as more than a grandmother. This retired teacher and school principal understood that her service to the family was part of her calling later in life. Something about her prayer life, her morning devotions, and her preparing meals for the family, as well as her way of being in the family, reflected to me a virtuous life. This I've tried to study and understand in my research on spirituality. Third, as a clinical psychologist who specializes in group therapy and who's interested in the relational dimensions of spirituality, including how interpersonal relationships contribute to formation, I'm also pleased to have this opportunity to respond to Steve's work, as he is also a group therapy colleague. Steve, you made so many important points. I want to just highlight a few. First, the relational emphasis. I do want to say that psychologists, we talk about relationships, we say they're important, and then sometimes we just focus on individuals. You have maintained that tension, but it is a tension for us. And your interest in human and divine differentiation. The question that you raise is, what is it about human persons that they are morally transformed by God in these ways? You engage Christian theology and also God's role in the notion of differentiated relationality. Steve states further that his focus will be more than on individual virtue formation. He'll interact with communal, organizational, and systemic dynamics. One way I think about this is that virtue formation is a team sport. A practical application. One question this raises for me: when we encourage spiritual disciplines or participation in spiritual practices, do we focus enough on not only the individual's growth and their relationship to God, but also how this individual is growing in their relationships, not only the close ones, but also the casual ones? Group spiritual direction and Steve's relational ecologies, and we've heard other examples, are wonderful examples of group formational opportunities. Virtue formation happens so fully in relationship. I fully agree with how you've articulated that, Steve. But I think we often miss opportunities to explore, understand, and challenge this interpersonal dimension. Now, central to Steve's approach, which he's noted, is the concept of differentiation of self, and also this notion of differentiated relationality. I see differentiated relationality as a model for virtue formation. Concept of differentiation of self, Steve already gave some of the background from family systems therapy. The idea that you are, family systems theory, the idea that you understand who you are individually in the midst of the relationship with your family. And that's a developmental process that occurs over time. And he highlighted the dimensions: autonomy, connection, the regulation of emotion, and then relating across sociocultural differences. The concept of differentiation of self is so important that I want to draw more on some work that Steve did with Janine Brown on an article published in the Journal of Psychology and Theology, Converging Horizons for Relational Integration, Differentiation-Based Collaboration. Now, this was originally written to address disciplinary differences. That wouldn't be relevant here, would it? But also applies more broadly. I'm going to take an extended quote. By differentiated, we mean a capacity to maintain a high level of differentiation of self across disciplinary differences. Differentiation also involves an ability to manage one's own anxiety in relating across disciplinary differences while continuing to humbly explore the possibilities of collaboration. This requires a commitment to bearing fruit than simply validating one's own perspective or disciplinary omnipotence. When capacities for differentiation are low in any relationship, there can be a tendency to rely on hierarchy, to privilege one side over the other in an effort to reduce the anxious tension of ambiguity or conflict. Our Trinitarian theological perspective shapes our commitment to differentiated relationality that remains in conversation, since God as Trinity always exists in differentiated relationships of mutuality and cooperation. My own comment, if that could be our model more and more and more. Returning to the quote, in this way, effective collaboration between theologians and social scientists or pastors and therapists reflects the image of our differentiated God. And empirically, differentiation of self is proving to be positively associated with numerous indices of virtue and Christian spiritual formation. End of quote. What this and Steve's paper underscores is that God in three persons, the Trinity, is a biblical example of God's commitment to unity in diversity and differentiated relationality. Practical application. If I had to ask one question of leaders, students, friends, those seeking to grow in spiritual formation, it would be, what happened today, this week, this month, this year, that helped you grow in differentiated relationality? Now, what would the question that they hear be? I'd have four. What challenged your sense of being your own person and being in connection to others? What challenged your sense of that? In response to this challenge, describe the emotional turmoil and anxiety that you felt in response to this. Third, to what extent did difference, sociocultural, ideology, perspective, discipline, whatever difference, play a role in this? And finally, what did God reveal to you? So we discussed the key emphasis. I've discussed that, the relational, the model, differentiated relationality, and now to the process. How is this virtue formation occurring? Steve's model, I love the visual that he showed you. It shows how relationships are kind of like a holding environment for this moving through, dwelling and seeking. The divine, the articulation of the role of the divine and God in this. What does it mean to practice forgiveness out of not just dutiful obedience, but that sense of a personal change that's occurring with God working in the midst of that? God is intimately involved, obviously, in virtue formation that happens for us. But then he highlights a human dimension. Many of you here, pastors, therapists, spiritual directors, mentors, professors, play a role in transformation for folks. But then when he draws on the clinical example, he notes that the therapist embodies these virtues in a certain way. And the non-directive exploratory question, people don't do what you tell them to do. Right, parents? That actually doesn't work. They hear it, but that's not how really change happens, right? But it's engaging in the process over time, and now we understand more in terms of mirroring what's happening neurobiologically for people, what's happening within their bodies, what people are picking up. That's really powerful for what brings about change. So let me give you a worship example from our research on worship leaders. We had worship leaders exemplars were nominated for their faithfulness and ability to engage the congregation in spirit-filled worship. This was a project supported by the John Templeton Foundation. The worship leaders articulated the contrast between a worship leader cheerleading the congregation to worship God, so then you're mirroring a cheerleader, and a worship leader worshiping God before the congregation, night and day. Worship leaders even describe sometimes not feeling ready to lead others in worship and leaning on the worship team, asking for prayer, and often the Lord and the congregation gave them strength to lead on those particular Sunday mornings. Amen, pastors? Their authenticity involved not performative behavior, trying to be the perfect worship leader, but honest and open confession of their frailty that was followed by communal support. Steve notes the challenge in measuring authentic practice, but I think your data, some of our qualitative data, it can help us get at that. We've got to listen even more carefully to the testimonies that articulate some of these dimensions. And I would add that authentic practice does not require perfect practice, but growing in yielding to God and acknowledging our struggle related to this yielding. Our behavior matters, but our yielding matters more. Our heart for God matters more. He does not need perfect vessels. He often chooses to use vessels yielded to God for his purposes. So, what would I add? I just say to what Steve is doing, I love his shout out, if you will, to theologian Howard Thurman from his work in Luminous Darkness. The importance of relationship to others. We just need to lean more and more and more. You know, my faith is so much an individual faith. I just need to get saved, and then, everything's cool on the other side. No. But what Thurman says, a quote from him that I love that you lifted up, the religious experience, as I've known it, swings wide the door, not merely into life, but into lives. Beautiful. We need to attend more to how God is working in these moments, for sure. But what I found so powerful is really to think about a biblical perspective on difference. Many of us are struggling in thinking about that. I had not looked at the Trinity as the example of difference with and psychologically, our work assuming difference causes such conflict and tension. We have not served people well in that. We have not served people well. We need to bring this understanding that difference can be a wonderful place for cooperation and work together. So I love that you've lifted that up. And its economic, cultural, and psychological biases have influenced our views about difference more than a biblical perspective. That is a problem. So, what's ideal virtual formation? There's no such thing, but I'm still going to play with that. Is it to move through your anger and fear and get to virtue? I used to be an anger researcher, so my answer to that is no. Anger is important. Then is the goal to eventually have less anger and fear and live virtuously? I wouldn't even say that. The wisdom and genius, I would view, of the RSM is a dialectic between dwelling and seeking. They flow together. The ebbs and flow of the spiritual life. That is actually the good news. Not that it's all great, but you can ebb and flow, and it's real. It's real. For me, the deepest hurts and most intense anger and disappointment have resulted in the development of virtues of patience, forgiveness, even joy. But this has been directly related to whether I look to the Lord and wise brothers and sisters for strength, guidance, and meaning. I don't see anger and fear as serving contrary functions to the practice of virtue. You think you're a forgiving person until you feel that someone has done the unforgivable. So let me give a recent everyday example. I'm not a compulsive. You don't need to diagnose me. I'm just letting you know, but you all do what you're going to do. Primarily, 2 painters have been repairing my stucco and wood at my home as they have been engaged in painting the exterior and interior of my home. This has been important due to smoke damage from the Eaton fire. I live in Pasadena. Not dramatically affected, but also an opportunity for home improvement. They're doing an excellent job, even as we speak. It's better that I'm not there. And cleaning up as they go. But as I'm working from home and on sabbatical these days, I find myself wanting to check on them to see if they're doing things as I intend. Now that's important a little bit, but as they move to the inside of my home, I have had increasing anxiety and angst as my things have been needed to be moved around. I've needed to tolerate the disorder for them to do their job. I've also had to trust that they will respect my boundaries in my home. No shoes in my home. You know they have to wear their shoes. So when they move a piece of furniture that had not been moved for years, I keep a clean house, but still, I am amazed, on the one hand, that there's not a mound of dust. But when I rush to clean it up, they're assuring me this is their job. We just sprayed the outside of your house, got the soot off. We have to clean before we paint. Let us do it. My impatience and intolerance was surprising me. Literally, I gotta get up. They're right around the corner. I can see it. I want to get up. And I'm well aware that it would be offensive for me to step in and clean. As I would be communicating that their efforts are insufficient, I'd be challenging their competence and being disrespectful. Now, what amazes me is that at some moments, I don't care about their experience. I think I'm an empathic person, but no. I simply want to clean it my way. Let me get the Clorox. Now, should Clorox be on baseboard? Probably not, but then I know it'll really be clean. The Lord said, daughter, chill. I had to tell myself over and over again, stand down, Alexis, stand down. I have been on the oppressive end of narcissistic insistence by others that only their way works. The Lord continues to form me. They're not done, and I'll return home. But the Lord is continuing to form me in this small way. And I call this developing virtue formation muscles. What did the Lord do from a differentiation of self window? Thank you. He helped me regulate my emotions. I really need to calm down. I was really surprised. I was getting agitated. I gained more relational flexibility that balanced connection. These painters, they are taking care of my home in a wonderful way. They're caring about my home. The connection balance between desire for autonomy and control, because it's a control issue for me operating there. And finally, I have a much deeper appreciation for the profession of painting. I really do. And found a way to cooperate effectively rather than dominate. Now, by the way, there was plenty decluttering on the top of my china cabinet that I could take care of and forget about the dust on the floor. So there was work for me to do. So I finally want to end with a word of caution from Steve. The danger of undifferentiated leaders. And quote from him, poorly differentiated leaders, family members, or friends tend to overfunction, rescue, or seek to control outcomes of crucible dilemmas in ways that impede virtue formation. Or they distance themselves when the crucible heats up. This often happens when our own anxiety reaches a level we cannot regulate, and it causes us to overreach or run away. The implications of your work are phenomenal. This means leaders and other members of communities supporting those in moral crucibles, you noted, need high levels of differentiation to offer respectful and non-anxious presence, curiosity, care, and wisdom. Colleagues, brothers, and sisters, may we find a way to stand and be together in the midst of our own anxiety, others' anxiety, and these anxiety-provoking times, knowing that God is with us and is a present help. Amen.